Very much.
James, I don't think you need any introduction, but obviously you'll explain the reasons that you're here to talk about making rail work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. My colleague, Michael von Droggenbroek, is on Zoom, and he and I will be undertaking this presentation, and we will go through it as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you.
So who are we? Because it's a question we're asked every time we have one of these presentations. So Making Rail Work is a collective of business professionals and residents of both the Bay of Plenty and Waikato. And our belief is that public transport connectivity is fundamentally important to our community and to our economy. And as a country, we need to change our approach and attitude to passenger rail. And services between Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland provide an opportunity to do that. Katrina Ramage, unfortunately, is our project director. She can't be here today because she has some personal issues to deal with. But Michael and myself will take you through this presentation. We have an extended Making Rail Work team behind us with a number of professionals and consultants. But the important point to emphasise at the moment is that we are a collective, we're voluntary, other than some funding from Bay Trust and Trust Waikato. We're not a commercial organisation, so we are doing this essentially in our own time. So just a few common misconceptions. Michael will talk about the rail ones in a second, but I just want to make the point that we're not saying that passenger rail is something that can be delivered next week or even in the next few years. This is a long-term process, and that was without all of the challenges that have now come on board with the recent weather events affecting the rail network. But our view is we need to start the conversation and we need to start to do long-term planning around rail. Michael, if I can bring you in, could you just briefly go through some of those misconceptions that relate specifically to the rail network?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. One of the ones I'd like to touch on first is the interregional passenger rail will compromise the ability to move freight on the Tauranga corridor. It's very true that the Hamilton to Tauranga corridor all the way up to Auckland's busy with Metroport. You have Genesis Coal and various logging freight as well as Fonterra on parts of the corridor. However, on the maximum day, the number of trains that traverse the corridor is up to 36 through the Kaimai Tunnel. And that's a maximum. Most days are significantly more than that, and it's very rare that you would ever have that many trains moving through a day. So that would be basically 18 in each direction. So there's still quite a lot of capacity on the corridor to have passenger add. I might add that at the recent annual review to the Infrastructure and Transport Committee, KiwiRail stated quite clearly and quite strongly that capacity on the corridor is not an issue, and there is still significant capacity to grow. The bigger issue is really the taps at either end of the corridor at the ports in Auckland and in Tauranga. So there's no doubt that more trains can move. I think some people often refer to the Kaimai Tunnel being a constraint. Well, the way to look at the Kaimai Tunnel is just a single piece of track currently. The transit time is between 10 and 15 minutes to get through that tunnel. So again, it's not a major constraint. Some improvements might have to be made to make passenger reliable in terms of extraction in the same way they do in other tunnels in New Zealand. For example, the Rimataka Tunnel is just as long as is the Aotearoa Tunnel in the South Island. So again, it's a bit of a myth that the Kaimai Tunnel is a major constraint. There's plenty of capacity there with some modest interventions, and that includes signalling and double tracking. And the other thing is, as James talked about, is it is a long-term program. So we're not saying trains next week or even next year. So looking at that, I think it's really, really important. And also the issue that people often bring up is rail doesn't go where people need to go and it's too slow and everything. That's not true at all. There's a lot of people can use rail from central nodes to central node, and last mile, as they call it internationally, or last kilometre movement is quite easily addressed, and quite often you can have park and ride facilities, and that's shown in various parts of New Zealand already. That distance from the nearest railway station isn't necessarily a major constraint. Next slide, please. So some of the critical success factors for passenger rail include supporting economic growth. I won't go through all of these in details. Supporting economic growth is really important. It's an enabler of growth in a way that other transport modes aren't necessarily able to do. It's demonstrated around the world, and that rail is actually a major multiplier for growth. It encourages agglomeration and encourages intensification of industry and central nodes of livability, etc. So that's really important, given some of the things that we've just been talking about in regards to Tauranga's challenges. Also, improving corridor and resilience, transportation by rail and having an alternative mode in Tauranga. You're particularly blessed because you've got the Kaimai Tunnel, is quite resilient, and it's probably somewhat more resilient than going over the Kaimai Range or through the Karangahake Gorge. So it does add an element of resilience. And also you can use the corridor and rail because it's built to such a high standard for things like telecommunications and fibre, major utilities. The rail corridor is ideally situated and able to do those things, and that's been proven in New Zealand already in the last 20 or 30 years. Obviously, climate change is a big part of it, reducing greenhouse gas emissions per vehicle kilometres travelled. And basically, rail is up to 3 times more efficient for freight, and for passenger, it can even be more so in terms of vehicle kilometres travelled. Encouraging land value capture through transit hubs, transit-orientated development. This is a part of the economic case for rail. It's really important. It enables people to commit to growth on certain nodes, encourages new towns. There's been quite positive acceptance of that around the world, and I've recently done a paper on that, which I've just recently published on my LinkedIn page, but it was also presented to the Parliamentary Select Committee. Attracting overseas investment to New Zealand is also important. Rail attracts investment because it gives greater certainty to people about intensification. You see this at places like Ruakura Hub, for example, or Tainui are investing in rail connectivity with their new intermodal inland port at Ruakura, just east of Hamilton there. So there's a whole lot of other things on there which I won't go on into at this stage, but I'll hand back to James to talk about the RTP and passenger rail.
Thank you, Michael. So this is just a very, very brief reminder that the Bay of Plenty and the Waikato RPTPs both are committed to further investigations into development of interregional passenger rail services. So hopefully we're pushing an open door, and we're looking forward to working with those councils to progress those particular actions. The map on the right-hand side comes from the Waikato RPTP, and it just goes to show that rail is actually only one part of the integrated public transport system picture. You'll hopefully see the yellow line very faintly snaking from Hamilton up to Auckland, and then the grey line across from Hamilton to Tauranga. So ideally, of course, what we'd like to see is that yellow line, which is the current Tuya service, extended to Tauranga and significantly improved. So there's that through connection to Hamilton and to Auckland, so to make the Golden Triangle really connected. It isn't just about trains as well. That's the other point to make here. So these are Katrina's slides, and I'll try and do them justice. But making rail work is, as much as anything, about what's called a development cooperative. And this combines a traditional development corporation model, like the one that was used to deliver the London 2012 Olympics, but it gives it a Kiwi twist. And the Kiwi twist is a cooperative structure. So the thing to remember about a cooperative is that all the members have equal rights and equal say in what happens. So it can't be taken over by one organisation or one sectional interest. So we believe a cooperative approach therefore enables a much more community-based, collaborative planning approach. And this slide just simply sketches out what it could look like with a cooperative board in the middle, the government political on the red, and the officers and civil servants on the green. So Fonterra and Mitre 10, they are two very famous Kiwi cooperatives. So Fonterra, you think cows, Mitre 10, you think hammer drills, making rail work, you think development around stations, because the stations are the hubs, the nodes where development can be clustered in the future and provide much greater access, which we can use a development cooperative to get all those landowners together to work together to develop their land in the way that actually suits the community and society. That's really what we're looking to do. I won't go through this structure in any great detail, but essentially it would be constructed around a development oversight board with advisory committees and a whole series of work streams at the bottom there. The important point to make here is that what we're not looking to do is actually just set up another structure. So we're not looking to employ even more consultants or contractors. We're actually looking to use this and use existing resources, secondments from existing organisations, not just to create a whole new bureaucratic structure. So again, that's a clear difference from other forms of organisation and governance. So Michael will very, very quickly just tell you about what we've done so far and what we're planning to do before I'll finish with summing up.
Yes, engagement activity to date. So we've been quite busy over the last 12 months in particular. In May of last year, the Making Rail Work was republished after a 6 months evidence review, and we've been engaging with various government agencies since that period, including Ministry of Transport, Kiwi Rail, Waikato High, various regional councils in the area, particularly Waikato and Tauranga City Council. Also, we've been talking quite a lot to the central government agencies, in particular the Parliamentary Select Committee hearings on interregional passenger rail that happened in September to November of last year. That's a inquiry into the future of interregional passenger rail, and we've been quite strong in our submissions in that regard and had particularly good feedback from all political parties, including Acton, National and Labour, as well as the Greens, as you would expect. We've been recruiting also a support team, and we've been having positive engagement with the likes of Te Waka and Futureproof, and we've also presented to various other agencies, including Priority One, been talking with Ports of Tauranga and Bay of Plenty Regional Councils, and the work that we're doing today, for example, is evidence of that process. Next slide, please. So where to from here? So we're looking to publish an open letter to all political parties to include passenger rail as a part of their manifesto. We've had particularly good engagement from some parties, including the ACT Party. Simon Court, for example, already has spoken quite positively to us with our ideas, as has National through David Bennett, and we've got very good engagement with Michael Wood's office and Michael Wood himself also. So we're looking also to contribute to the government policy, the GPS Statement on Land Transport, that's just been released for consultation in draft form. We're publishing a second report, Beyond the Tracks. There's a very important rail conference in Wellington on the 28th of June that we're a key part of, including and that will be various political leaders from all the parties that are interested in this in various ways, as well as key agency leaders from Kiwi Rail, Transdev, Auckland One Rail, etc., and the Transport Agency, NZTA, as well as Ministry of Transport. So we've got excellent engagement leading up to the general election later this year, and finalising our submission, and looking forward to the revised government policy statement on transport, and taking on beyond that is the Land Transport Plan in April and the National Land Transport Programme in June of 2024. So we're very busy, and we continue to sort of make rapid progress in this space. Back to James.
Thank you. So this is the final slide. So what are we asking of you as the Regional Transport Committee today? So firstly, honest and constructive feedback and ideas for further investigation. I want to make it very clear, we don't have all the answers. We are looking to work with people across the region who can help us with those answers. So hopefully we will establish a close working relationship with Regional Transport Committee and its members, starting today. We would like to ask for, in principle, support for progressing a development cooperative, working with those colleagues, particularly those involved in the regional spatial strategy. In principle, doesn't mean you need to agree with everything we say, or it doesn't mean to say you don't have any concerns or you're not somewhat sceptical, but we're looking for, I guess, some constructive engagement and challenge. Interesting, the discussions around UFTI a little bit earlier in the meeting. So we do feel that a review of UFTI and a re-examination of the rail-enabled growth option would be a good idea. That isn't to say that we believe necessarily everything in Ufty is wrong and that connected centres needs to be thrown out, but we do feel that Ufty did provide some good evidence of what rail could do in certain circumstances, so it would be useful to re-examine that work. Very keen to work with the Bay Plenty Regional Council, Public Transport Committee in particular, to progress that RPT policy and work in partnership with Waikato Regional Council. I will just refer to my previous role just once. I don't particularly want this to be yet another burden on my former colleagues in the Regional Transport Plan team at the Bay of Plenty. So one of the things we'll need to think about is, how are the resources going to be allocated to this, because those folks are already extremely busy. So it's not just another ask without more resources. Finally, and this is perhaps the big one, at some point we're going to have to do a business case, because we've got a lot of ideas, we've got what we think is a great concept, but it has to be tested with evidence, and we have to establish pretty critical things like who's going to use the service and how much are they going to pay for it and how much is it all going to cost. All those answers ultimately require a business case, so we would certainly be interested in discussing some kind of funding contribution to a business case through the next RLTP with the regional councils and local councils acting as approved organisations for that money. That's really all we want to say today. Happy to take any questions and hopefully look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Good to have you here, James, and another slick presentation. You were true to form. Before I hand over to Michael for comment, as you can appreciate, we can't make any fundamental decisions here today, but in good faith and as a gesture, I will certainly ask that those 6 key bullet points there be forwarded to staff and that they report back to us in due course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it.
You have my assurance on that. So, Michael, would you like to make some general comments?
Yeah, I think in terms of rail and the Bay of Plenty, this is a strategic question, and really we need the committee just to think upon the next 10 years and where does this particular mode sort of fit in that thinking in or out. So I'd be interested in hearing from the committee members around the sort of the strategic nature of what we're being asked, because preparation for this type of work can go into the years. And I agree with James in terms of the work that's required here is kind of considerable. So there's a lot of stage gate processes that you'd go through, and it's the kind of thing where we either divert is the wrong word, use staff time in order to consider these questions on a strategic nature for the 10-year view or not.
Angus, you're there somewhere with your hand up. Here he comes.
Kia ora koutou. Sorry, first of all, for not being there today. We've got quite a bit to do in terms of the Hawke's Bay rebuild, so I thought it was sensible to stay in Wellington, but it has meant I've been sitting here listening and probably not participating as much as I normally would, so apologies for that. I just wanted to make a couple of comments in terms of the network side and just support a few of the things that James and Michael have just passed on to you around the capacity of the network, how it interrelates with the freight piece and those sort of misconceptions around the Kaimai tunnel. So I just want to be clear that we agree with the views that they've just said there. There absolutely is capacity on the network. It's not there isn't trains butting up against each other every single 10 minutes or so, as you see in highly dense parts of the network like in Auckland. There is room for other trains to be running on the network there. There absolutely would need to be some network additions made for to enable additional services to come through, and Michael's right. Those are things like some longer crossing loops either side of the tunnel so that you can stage things sensibly and run them through. There would also have to be some serious work done inside the Kaimai tunnel, because in the end we have a regulator being Waka Kotahi, different hats from the folks who are sitting there with you today, and they would expect some improvements to be made to the tunnel in order for passengers to be passing through it. So all of those are questions that need an answer, and as James said, those are questions that would need to be answered through a business case. I think my suggestion to the folks here is there is work ahead of us to do that. Waikato Regional Council has put into their RPTP an intention to do a feasibility study about this over the next 3 years. I would encourage Bay of Plenty to join alongside them and do that bit of work. We'll be able to support them with the network requirements, and I think Michael and his team, I mean, they have a role to play as community advocates by feeding into that piece. That's probably enough.
Cool. Thanks, Angus. Any final comments? Oh, beg your pardon, here we go. We're going to get train services to Whakatane and to the west. Mayor Denia.
Thank you. I think it's a very intriguing proposal, and I thank you for bringing it forward. Passenger rail services in this part of the world has been kicked around for some time, and one hears different views about whether it's fundamentally feasible or not, whether the population's enough. Personally, I'm quite excited by at least the prospect of it, and would like to understand whether it is indeed feasible. And so there's a number of asks there, and ultimately a business case or feasibility study sounds like it would be useful for us.
So before I pass over to Mayor Luca, just as a point of clarification, is this mainly a focus that's going to occur around the Western Bay, or, because I hear former Mayor Chadwick sitting on my shoulder screaming in my ear.
So did I.
I thought you came from Rotorua. So
Yeah. Look, at the moment,
save me here, James.
yeah, I will save you. Right, okay, Councillor Thurston, since you've been so kind to me, I will absolutely emphasise that it shouldn't just necessarily be about Tauranga. My view is that Rotorua is connected to the rail network, can be connected to the Golden Triangle. So as part of any feasibility study and business case, we will be very interested in including Rotorua in that, because the more centres you have outside of Auckland feeding into Auckland, the more demand you're likely to create. Of course, you will have costs associated with another line. But look, at the moment, we're very flexible. It's not Tauranga and nothing else.
I just wanted to get that into the minutes, as you can well imagine.
It's very, very clear.
His worship, Mayor Luca.
I would strongly endorse what you guys are doing. I think rail was fundamental in early development of all nations. There's real value in that infrastructure, and I guess it's going to have its day again for maybe different reasons. I've got a basic question for you though. How much, you said in your talk that it wasn't all about tracks and rolling stock, but how much new rail track have we developed in this country in the last 30 years, and who paid for it?
Right, Michael will answer that one because he's our rail expert.
Yes, well, that's an excellent question. There hasn't been a lot of new rail track developed. What's really been happening in the last 30, 40 years, is particularly in the last 10 years, is improvement to existing railways, adding capacity, for example, double tracking in Auckland. And there was probably about a good 20 kilometres of double tracking added to the network, where you previously had single track. There was one additional spur, the Manukau branch line, that was only about 3 kilometres double track in Auckland, that was added in 2010. Basically, what you've really seen is a rehabilitation of the network, bringing it up to more modern standards. There has been some retreat, in fact, away from connectivity to parts of the network, and I point out about the previous question about Rotorua. It had passenger trains until October 2001, and they were cancelled at that time, and it hasn't really seen any passenger trains since that period. But overall, the network is in quite good shape. It's tending to be reinvested in. There's been a lot of commitment in the last 5 to 10 years in particular, particularly in Auckland and Wellington, but there's also been quite a lot of rehabilitation, and the railway generally is taking higher axle loads at generally more consistent speeds, not necessarily faster, obviously, at top speed, but more consistent speeds, which is really important. So the network's becoming more resilient as we replace what was essentially 19th century infrastructure in many places.
So how was that 19th century infrastructure paid for? How was it funded?
So yeah, that's an excellent question. Initially, there was some private investment in the railways in New Zealand in the 1860s and 1870s, but Julius Vogel, about 1873, went and got a loan from the United Kingdom to fund the railways. So it was actually funded offshore predominantly. And then that was paid back via annuities, etc., and opened up the country. And the payback was more through economic growth and wealth that the railway connections instigated. In particular, Michael Joseph Savage in 1938 said something to the fact that for years and years the landlord stood still and was making lots of money off the land that was developed, but meanwhile the railways were painted on the clouds as losing money all the time. And when one looks at it more holistically, you would say, well, the railways as a system didn't capture the value it created. That value the railway created was captured by everywhere else in New Zealand. New Zealand would not be what it is today without the rail network. And that's a proven fact right from the 1860s onwards. So yes, it was funded by overseas investment, taxpayers, some private investment in the early days, and more over time. We're suggesting that value contributions and value capture can help fund the railway going forward into the future.
Can I just add to that in terms of how it's currently funded? So maintenance and renewal for the entire national rail network is paid for from the Rail Network Investment Program, and that is paid to us, Kiwi Rail, by Waka Kotahi, so it's part of the NLTF. However, it isn't entirely 100% paid for by what we'd normally regard as NLTF being pit and ruck, fuel excise duties and road user charges. The government tops up the NLTF to pay for the vast bulk of what's in the Rail Network Investment Program, so it's actually general taxation that's paying for it. We also, Kiwi Rail, pay into the NLTF. We pay a track user charge as a contribution towards our wear out costs as a freight operator of using the rail network. Then in addition to that, because we're an owner and we have access arrangements with other rail users, the main ones being Greater Wellington Regional Council for their metropolitan services and Auckland Transport for their metropolitan services. So they pay us a contribution towards the maintenance of their networks in those two centres. So there is a fair bit of mix, but generally speaking, the vast bulk of those costs are paid for by taxpayers, but there are some user pays in there as well. And I suppose the next question that someone might be interested in asking is, well, is that reasonable? Our view is, yes, it is reasonable, because maintenance of an asset is always needed in order to make use of those assets, and using those assets generates up to $2.1 billion of economic value every year.
Yeah, Commissioner Selwyn.
Just a quick observation, we shouldn't forget 4, 5 or 6 billion, whatever the number is, that's going into the Auckland Central Rail Link at the moment, which is being funded both by the City Council and by central government, and plans of the current government at least to spend somewhere between 14 and 30 billion on a light rail connection in Auckland. So just how all this gets funded, just only knows.
Yeah, I might add to that I wrote a paper recently that basically suggested ways of funding, and internationally, and I've worked quite a lot overseas, particularly in Australia and in the Middle East. They have what they call suburban rail loop in Australia, and the whole idea of that is that it's funded through value capture and all the agglomeration benefits. And my paper recently explored that in New Zealand as a way of helping to fund the railway, because I think we can all agree that over the longer term, the taxpayer can't fund all this directly. I think the whole idea of our report is to suggest alternative ways of funding rather than just relying on taxpayers or ratepayers bearing the burden of that. And as I pointed out in that rough quote from Michael Joseph Savage from 1938, which is quoted in my submission, it's really true that a lot of the value created by railways and railway systems are captured by the private sector, and they're basically taking it as a free good.
I always remember when Lyndon Johnson came to New Zealand and he said to Holyoake that you won't know where I'm from, but I'm from the state of Texas, and it is so big it takes 3 days to cross it in a train. And Holyoake said yes, and we got slow trains here too. So there you go. Okay, Councillor Shirley.
Just history repeating itself. I think it's worth making a contribution. The original investment of the roading network, of course, was meant to be on a formula of betterment, and the betterment is huge. The early settlers getting their wool and the refrigerated shipping their meat to market was huge, but the landed gentry who captured the parliament in the 1880s, 1890s totally reneged on that, and changed it, and the taxpayer bore the brunt, and the Vogel loans weren't paid back until the 1950s. Essentially almost bankrupted the country.
Okay,
Yes,
James,
and
so we're in.
And that's a key lesson to learn, and that's one of the key lessons we're saying, that you need to have a mechanism in place to make sure that doesn't happen again for transport investment more generally, not just for rail, for all transport really.
Okay. So Michael and James, thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you, guys.
And as I said, you have our assurance that we've referred it to staff, and they will get back to us in due course, commenting on your 6 bullet points.
Thank you very much, and great to see you all again. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, since there's an action in there, we'll result to receive it. I will move, seconded Commissioner Selwood. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried.